Could everyone take your seats, please? We're going to get started. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Oh, we are missing just one panelist. Good. All right. I'm Matt Rojansky. I'm the director here at the Kennan Institute, which means that I deal largely with Russia, and now that means nonstop crisis. And so I was chatting with Bijan before the beginning of the panel about how there's a growing, I think, inclination, certainly among scholars of a certain generation in this town, to talk about a new Cold War. And while that might or might not be true when it comes to Russia's relations with the United States and the West, one thing that's really different than the world pre-1989 to 91 is the role of the rest. And so I think it's important that on this panel we have representatives of major world economies, which sometimes also have their issues with the West, and which of course are largely dependent also on energy export pricing. But I think that the message, or at least a message, that we ought to take away from the importance of a great many economies in this conversation, which are neither Russia nor the traditional West, is that these economies matter for the world. And I hope that that issue can be raised, and that the implications of what's going on now between Russia and the West can also be raised in that context in our discussion. With that, let me just thank you all once again for joining us. We have a number of dignitaries in the room and Wilson Center trustees. I'm very pleased to have such a great group. I will hand the floor over after this panel to my colleague Jan Kalitsky to wrap up. But just to introduce him now, he's a public policy scholar, at the Wilson Center, where he leads our global and regional energy series. He also co-edited the book Energy and Security: Strategies for a World in Transition. Jan, I hope you're in the room. There you are. There's Jan Kalitsky. Okay. Now let me introduce the panel. I think what I'll do actually is just introduce each of them, then let them speak, and then introduce the next one so as not to throw a bunch of bios at you. But we'll start with Bijan Khajehpour. He's the managing partner of Atieh International, which is based in Vienna. It's a strategic consulting firm focusing on the Middle East. He co-founded Atieh in Tehran in 1994, and since then he's focused on strategic consulting for Iranian and international companies, and has a graduate education in management and economics in both Germany and the United Kingdom, as well as in France. So a worldly wise individual. Bijan, the floor is yours.
Let me just change this.
You have the clicker?
Yeah, I do. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's great to be back here. It's a great topic, great community to discuss it. So let me just move forward. We don't have much time. I will share with you some general comments, a few very specific comments on three of the major Persian Gulf producers, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. And then I will close with some concluding remarks. Obviously, we can't cover everything in 10 minutes, but what will happen is you will have these slides later on the center's website. You can go through some of the data that I've included. But let's start with a historical perspective. Some of the speakers in the earlier panel mentioned that. When you look at the history of oil price over the past 25 years, you realize very quickly that what we have had as the sort of $100+ era has only been the past few years. When you look at the overwhelming majority of the past 25 years, we have looked at $20 to $40 or even $20 to $30 of oil price. So essentially $50 oil is not a disaster. The disaster is when it actually gets to the $9 era. That was in the late 90s. That would be a disaster for everyone. So we are not talking about a disaster. But there has been something very important. I will skip some of these. But the last time the oil price dropped, which was between 2007 and 2008, and a much more severe drop than what we have had in the past 7 months, OPEC actually came in. Here, OPEC actually cut output, and this is what turned the price around. What we have had this time is a completely inactive OPEC. OPEC has left the oil price to its own devices. And that's something that is new, and that's part of the insecurity in the market. It's a completely new situation for OPEC members and also non-OPEC members. So the decision to leave the market to its own devices has created a new unprecedented environment. What we can be certain of is that there is a desire by OPEC members, led by Saudi Arabia, to actually regain market share. OPEC's share of international oil production has gone down from about 50% to about 30%. Regaining it can only happen if they push out other producers. We heard about some of those other producers, non-OPEC producers. We will hear also about Russia in a minute. So it's important to understand that OPEC or Saudi Arabia leading that effort is trying to regain market share, to establish itself as the dominant producer. We heard earlier that the US in 2014 was the biggest oil and gas liquid producer. Essentially, in a different language, you can say the real swing producer of the world is the United States now. It's not Saudi Arabia anymore. And that is a major strategic and geostrategic shift that we have to take into account. Some of these countries that are now affected by the low oil price, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, they have huge reserves, and they can actually manage this era of low oil price without much problem. I will show you some of these reserves in a minute. Other countries, Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, are not in the same situation, even though Iran and Iraq both have reserves, but they obviously are not in the same financial position, overall financial and economic position. There will be a number of implications. There will be economic implications, investment implications that I will come back to. But I just want to mention quickly, I will skip some of these. There are three dimensions we need to look at when we look especially at the Middle Eastern economies, Persian Gulf economies. There are three distinct consequences. One is the consequence on the oil companies. We heard from our Mexican presentation about Pemex. Each of the oil companies in these countries are major, probably each of them are the largest company in their own economy, and the situation, the financial budgetary situation of that company has implications. Then you have to look at the consequences for government budgets. Will there be a budget deficit? Will there be implications for investments, etc.? And then we have to look at the impact on the overall economy. If a government has a budget deficit or financial difficulties, it doesn't mean that the economy is going to suffer as much. There are different degrees of government role in the economies. We don't have time to go through all of this, so I will mainly look at the government budgets, but I'm sure you can imagine some of the other implications. Let's have a quick look at the budget deficits in the year 2015 compared with the reserves, hard currency reserves that these countries have. Look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's proposed budget, also passed budget for 2015, will have a budget deficit of about $39 billion, compared to about $730 billion of hard currency reserves. We are talking about 19 years, roughly 19 to 20 years before they run out. So it's not something that they are going to be concerned about. They're going to be happily sort of covering these budget gaps. I'm not saying it doesn't have any implication for the economy. I'm just saying for the government, treasury, budget situation is not going to have that. Iran is a different situation, but even Iran has more than $120 billion in hard currency reserves that can actually cover some of the emerging budget deficits, and it's important to understand. So it's not a short-term crisis for any of these countries. It is a psychological problem. It's a medium-term crisis or problem, and we need to understand how they are going to react to each of these. Iraq has about $70 billion in hard currency reserves, and this year in 2015, an $18 billion budget. I will come back to these three countries in more detail. The other ones, smaller states in the Persian Gulf region, they all have zero deficit budget, so I can't comment on how long their reserves will last, but I think especially Qatar will need some of the reserves for the investments. I just want to also share another thing. One of the advantages that Iran has had in the past few years is that its economy has actually shifted from being a dollar-based economy to being more and more a euro-based economy. And when you compare these two, this is how much the oil price has fallen in dollars versus euros. In dollars, the oil price has fallen about 56% over the past 7 months. In euros, only 47%, because the euro has actually been devalued against the dollar, or the dollar has appreciated. So it's important, depending on which economy you're moving in, and in the case of Iran, you're moving in a more and more non-dollar economy thanks to US sanctions, so that it actually can be also beneficial for some of these economies. Let's focus on these three main economies, Saudi Arabia first, and then Iran and Iraq. Despite all the conspiracy theories that are being mentioned, my personal analysis is Saudi Arabia is looking to gain market share. Whether it will manage to do that is another question, because there are other players as well. We heard about some of the sort of players in Americas, but there is also Iraq. There is also the potential of a re-emergent Iran if there is a comprehensive deal, so we have to look at these things. But two consequences you can always foresee in these cyclical developments in oil price. One is that more expensive production will be moved out of the market, pushed out of the market. Even if it's just 10% of shale oil production in North America, well, it's 10% of shale oil production, so there will be more space for other producers. The other fact is, and we heard it in the first panel, that lower fuel prices, lower energy prices are going to lead to greater consumption. And this, again, will increase demand for oil. So this cyclical nature will always push oil back, and this is where Saudi Arabia or some of the OPEC members see themselves. Push some producers out, position yourselves to regain from the price going up in a few years. But when is that moment? Where is that point, and how long do these economies have to sort of withstand the situation? Experts think that it is 2020. So if they can manage till 2020, another 5 years, then they can actually benefit. But will they manage 5 years? We saw that in the case of Iraq, it's only 3 years of reserves that they can manage. So it's a very interesting dynamics, and we have to see whether they can actually achieve their goal. I would be very surprised if they achieve their goal. And as I said, there are other players, especially Iraq. We will come back to Iraq in a minute. One of the geopolitical risks that Saudi Arabia is faced with, and I would be interested to hear it later from a Russian colleague, is that both Tehran and Moscow, who are blaming the Saudi behavior for the current price situation, that they would try to hit back through geostrategic and geopolitical instruments in the region, in Syria and other places. And this whole dynamics, sort of the geopolitical repercussions of low oil price, is something we need to watch as well. There are also domestic risks for Saudi Arabia. We don't have time to go into a lot of details, but a lot of the inner transactions inside Saudi Arabia, and also the overall psychological impact of low oil price, will have an impact on employment, the employment situation, on some of the welfare spending, on some of the investment spending. For example, the outlook for investment, a 5-year cycle of investment in Saudi Arabia, has been basically downgraded from $175 billion to $127 billion. A lot of planned projects are going to be delayed or actually scrapped. That will have social and internal dynamics and repercussions. Let's focus on Iran. Iran's economy was under pressure before this event anyhow. I mean, because of sanctions, because of mismanagement, populist policies on the Ahmadinejad era. And obviously, again here, the psychological impact of low oil price is putting more pressure on the Iranian government. Interestingly, in Iran, even very moderate politicians have been framing or have been using the notion an oil war. They are basically describing the Saudi actions as oil war, and there are forces who say Iran needs to sort of respond, but the government remains committed to détente. You saw that also after the passing away of King Abdullah. Iran's foreign minister cut short his Davos trip and flew to Saudi Arabia to show respects. As I said, the government remains very committed to this détente, but it's obviously the oil situation is creating tensions. The good news in Iran is that whenever oil prices are lower than expected, the government is compelled to reform the economy and obviously create more space for the private sector. And that is happening. There is a much more intense campaign against corruption. There is much more openness to privatization, and there are tax reforms. For the first time, the government is putting pressure on religious and revolutionary foundations to pay taxes. So all of these things, and also the planned changes to the so-called cash handout or subsidy reforms, are all a consequence, actually a positive consequence of the low oil price. At the same time, the economy as a whole is resourceful enough for the government to actually fill the gaps in the budget. However, the key issue for Iran is not the oil revenue right now, it's actually the nuclear negotiations. I just wanted to share one graph with you. I won't go through the details. This is the World Bank's estimate of the next couple of years in terms of Iran's oil revenues between the two scenarios. There will be a nuclear deal or a comprehensive nuclear deal, and there won't be one. And you can see the difference. I don't know if you can see. It's basically, if there is no deal, Iran's annual revenues will be, for the government budget, will be about $25 billion a year. And if there is a deal, they could actually double by 2017, because obviously Iran can return to higher oil exports. And this is the point I was making. Saudi Arabia's belief that it can actually increase its market share could be undermined by Iran's return to the market. And our next, I will not go through these details, you can go through them later. The next country we are looking at is Iraq. And also in the case of Iraq, one of the interesting facts is that Iraq is compensating for the loss in revenue through lower prices through increased production. And you can best see that in the graphs that I've prepared. This is the price situation for Iraq. If you look at how it has come down from about 100 to about 50, these are the monthly revenues. But the interesting thing is the amount of export. These are the monthly exports. You can see how Iraq has actually increased its production and export, and it's planning to further increase that in 2015. So some of the market share that Saudi Arabia is hoping to regain may actually not necessarily go to Saudi Arabia. Once you enter into a price war, everyone can actually reduce prices and gain new clients. So it's a dynamics where we have to watch all of them at the same time. Let me conclude by saying basically the short answer to the question is what are the implications for the Persian Gulf producers? Well, all of them are going to suffer, but some of them are going to suffer in the shorter period, some of them are going to suffer in the medium period. The richer countries, the ones who have higher reserves, can withstand the situation by using their reserves, but there will always be political, internal, and also geopolitical and regional challenges, both threats but also sometimes opportunities. And the sad news is that at the time when this region actually needs more cohesion and more sort of win-win situations, the oil price scenario, the low oil price scenario, is creating more sort of lose-lose situations, unfortunately. I would not dare to predict anything for the next few months in terms of the geopolitical issues. And the fact is that most of the key parameters, the nuclear negotiations, the dynamics of the fight against ISIL, the situation in Iraq, Syria, etc., all of them are fluid, and anything can happen. So it's important to understand that all of these matters, including oil price, are actually in an interdependent relationship. And that's all I can tell you in terms of how we have to basically watch this region. Basically, we need to watch every single dimension and then to try to understand how they are impacting each other. That's where I'm going to stop and then look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bijan. So I'll stay here. So moving from the Gulf and the Middle East to West Africa, our next speaker is Yinka Omorogbe. Did I get that more or less right? Okay. Well, this is my Russian training, so it helps. So now I better get Mikhail's info right. She is the Nabo Graham Douglas Distinguished Professor of Law of the Nigerian Institute for Advanced Legal Studies in Abuja and Lagos. And she's adjunct professor at the Center for Petroleum, Energy Economics and Law at the University of Ibadan. She was formerly the dean of the law faculty at that university and secretary to the corporation and legal advisor for the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation from 2009 to 2011. She also received the gold medal of the Nigerian Association of Law Teachers and serves on the board of the International Journal of Energy and Natural Resources Law. She's a graduate of the University of Ife in Nigeria, as well as the London School of Economics and Political Science. So,
thank
the
you.
floor is yours, please. Yeah, you're welcome to.
Okay, thank you.
You may want to be able to see this.
Oh, sorry, it has fallen off already.
Ah.
Oh, well, I'll just hold it. Thank you.
You have the clicker?
Yeah, I have it with me.
Just put this right here.
Okay. Excuse me, sorry. I'm all over the place. Thank you. I just have 4 short slides. Obviously, I'm talking about something that will take a very, very long time, so I didn't do what my colleague did, which was give you a lot of detail, knowing I would not be able to present it. But I want to say that the primary issues for Nigeria are not actually the oil price. It is a major issue. It impacts very much on our budget. It impacts very much on everything because the majority of the money that the government uses is from oil. But we have some excuse me, issues that are really underlying and continuing. One is obviously underdevelopment. We have low economic indicators. We have the peculiar problem of being a global producer and exporter. That's also a major importer of petroleum products. So that means that we feel the negatives of high prices and low prices. So we're unlike many of the African countries who are actually much better off now with low prices. Although I suppose most of us will know that there's a lot of exploration taking place, and right now I'd say over half the African countries are going to be oil producers. There's some major discoveries in some places such as in Uganda, all over the place, Ghana, all around. But anyway, this is Nigeria. Now we remain dependent, like I've said, and we have a huge problem of mismanagement of resources. Now, the interplay of all this is that we have something such as Boko Haram, which a lot of people know about, and I think it's second only to ISIS as regards terrorism. But Boko Haram originated in the poorest state in Nigeria, which is Borno State. Huge poverty, terrible economic indicators there, and so the people were ripe for, you know, it was very, very fertile ground, basically. So these are some primary issues into which the oil price has gone. Now, we also have the problem of elections, which is not a problem, but when you have a very volatile country, a very large country, very diverse country, it's a very big issue. We have 2 major parties. We do not have any real manifestos. We have got the main party, the PDP there, which talks about its supposed gains. They're largely illusory. I don't really want to go into many of them, but really the things that they say they have done in many instances do not exist. There are lingering issues. The world knows about the Chibok girls who've been out for 1 year, and that says volumes. In fact, Boko Haram itself speaks a lot of volumes because, I mean, somebody came and talked to me and said, well, why is Boko Haram still on? What, do you mean the Nigerian military cannot, you know, root and defeat Boko Haram? Why is that not happening? Who knows? So you find again, if you look at development indicators, the people are poorer after 16 years of that party. There's the other party. It's got a credible presidential candidate. He has cult status in many, many states in Nigeria. And in fact, all over the country, he's getting that now to a great extent. The vice presidential candidate is also very, very credible. And to many people, they represent change. But change to what? How will they do what they say they will do? There are many things that they say they will do. But if you are a person who wants to know how, and if you actually want to have facts, they're very, very short of facts. So they talk, for example, about feeding all school children. How? From where? You know, they've got to tell us how they're going to actually do some of these things. They're not doing that, so that's a big problem. So what do we have? We have a lot of primordial sentiments. We have people who are voting for a party for a reason that is not at all practical, you know, ethnic reasons. We don't want a return of the South, of the Northerners again. So we're going to stick with the People's Democratic Party under Jonathan, or we're tired of all these Niger Delta people. We've had them all around and they've done nothing, and so we will go to the APC. So it depends. And that is why there is a lot of apprehension right now. So into this mix, what's the impact? Now, would high oil prices positively affect Nigeria's major issues? Well, the government exists on oil. It's had a lot of oil money over the past few years. What has it spent it on? Has it spent it on the people? So now there's less money. What impact has it made on the people? We've had a petroleum subsidy for a long time, and it has been shown very graphically, and it's really in the public domain. It's been shown that a lot of this has been wasted. It's been shown that it's very opaque. You cannot really put good numbers on the subsidy, so you can see that it has been used as a vehicle for siphoning out money. So what will happen? The good news is with low prices, at a point you can't talk about subsidies anymore. So that will help if it will be taken out. We don't know yet. So what is my premise in a nutshell? My premise is that good governance is the major issue. It's not oil prices. There are a lot of things that go with oil prices. Obviously, the budget is impacted. We have a problem. The sovereign wealth fund obviously will grow at a slower rate. But you know, before those prices, the sovereign wealth fund was already being depleted. So oil prices alone will not make a difference to that. A lot of what we're talking about has simply to be good governance. With low oil prices, there are austerity measures that people talk about. I can say categorically that I do not believe the Nigerians will take kindly to any austerity measures right now, because of the wastage, the obvious wastage that they have seen around. They will wonder why you have to tax them for certain things when they can see certain things being done. And at election time in Nigeria, a lot of money flies around. A lot of money is spent. So, okay, we have low prices, we have the exchange rate going off, skyrocketing. But yes, do we know that it is the oil price that is causing this, or is it because of the large volumes of money that are moving around? And so I put this here because you find the West always comes in with this assistance thing and the rescue mission thing, which I'm not really too much of a, well, that's another story anyway. But what I think is that it is good for us to understand each other. I am aware that Africa is not a high priority. I mean, I was looking at foreign policy and I see that a lot of the international relations experts don't see that anything to do with Africa is really an issue. It's a back burner issue to a great extent. But from Boko Haram, you can see that what is happening in a highly populated continent has the capacity in these days of globalization to affect everybody. It's good to have a greater understanding of the issues and needs of the people, and willingness to help rather than rescue. And I think it's also important to realize that while cultures differ, in today's globalized world, standards cannot. A mistake that's often made in the West is that, well, okay, this is a basket case country, like somebody said of Venezuela. They definitely say it about my country as well. Yeah, but basket case or no basket case, good governance is good governance. And there is no country where that should be allowed and or condoned. There has to be one standard as regards that. Otherwise, the people, even, no matter how ignorant they are, will react, as has happened in other places and as has happened in a place like Borno State. And my position is that bad governance and corruption have reached their threshold in some countries, definitely in Nigeria. A lot of people are fed up, fed up of that, you know. And I believe that if regimes or people that perpetuate or allow these acts, negative acts, to continue, if they continue to be propped up, I believe that the repercussions all around the world will be terrible. And so it's important to understand that it is in places where there are institutions and there are structures that you can really sit down and talk in a logical and practical way about prices. But when you're dealing with a lot of distortions, you have to very much attack the things that are fundamental within those societies. And having a culture of good governance and encouraging it wherever you go for all of us is very important. And so I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You going to stay there? Tuba. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I guess you are. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Yinka. I think that's as far as it'll go, yeah. Well, we come next to a country that few would argue has not received enough attention, probably not the sort of attention it would like, though. And that's Russia. Mikhail Krutikhin is a partner and analyst at RusEnergy and the editor of the weekly newspaper RusEnergy. Previously, he was editor-in-chief of Russian Petroleum Investor and co-founder and principal of Prime Online Agency. Most interestingly, he began his career as a Farsi interpreter. I bet you didn't know that. In Iran for the Soviet military.
I tested his Persian, it's okay.
Okay. After which he joined the TASS news agency and worked as a correspondent and editor and ultimately the bureau chief for the Middle East. His doctorate is in history from the Academy of Social Sciences in Moscow. So, Mikhail, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for your kind words, ladies and gentlemen. The schedule is very tight, and so I'll have to omit a lot of arguments which are needed to understand what's going on in Russia, because sometimes the events defy human logic, not just well, starting with arithmetics. Well, first, when I heard today that some country was dependent, I think it was Mexico, 30% on oil and gas revenues, I envied that country because, you know, the Russian national budget depends on oil and gas 52%. When Mr. Putin was appointed president in the year 2000, it was less than 9%.
Wow.
But then he did everything he could to increase the dependence of Russia on oil and gas, and this is the result. So if the price of oil is just 50% of what it used to be, it would mean that the Russian national budget loses a quarter of its revenues. So that's how important it is for Russia. Well, basically, I have just spoken to a journalist here, and I told her that, well, maybe by the year 2030, Russia will become a net importer of oil. Because, well, first we see that new discoveries are very small and scattered around great distances. Ongoing projects, we call them brownfield projects, are approaching depletion. And the tight reserves are not shale oil, because Russian tight reserves are much more difficult to extract. There is plenty of oil in some geological horizons which are called Bijan Suite, and fracking just doesn't work there. It is very difficult to extract them. Well, we see that tax incentives are not adequate, and Russia has banned production sharing agreements to discourage foreign investors. Industry is dominated by absolutely inefficient and corrupt state-controlled companies. Foreign operators are discriminated against, and Western sanctions are in effect. So basically what we see now, this is a graphical slide which I borrowed from a Russian governmental organization. The Russian government hoped to keep oil production stable at about 10.5 million barrels per day, but only they said that it would only if tax incentives are introduced for tight oil. That white-colored area is actually what Russia is going to lose because of oil prices, because of the low oil prices. Because to produce that additional oil will cost about $85 per barrel. It will remain underground, so Russia will not take it out. Well, gas production. We know that Russia has a great amount of natural gas, but we see that ongoing projects that Gazprom has inherited from the Soviet era are also approaching depletion. We see that production and transportation costs grow. To produce 1,000 cubic meters of gas now costs about $47. It's not $2, it's not $7 as it used to be some 15 years ago. Well, domestic consumption is in stagnation, does not grow. We see that the US shale revolution made a terrible effect on the Russian gas production because it well affects the global market, not only the US market. LNG in Russia, I can produce figures, it is not competitive at all. The costs of producing Russian LNG are much higher than producing it in Canada, in the United States, Australia, and some other countries. Well, and demand for Russian gas is not growing, and China's gas market can perfectly well do without Russian supply. Well, this is a slide from BP. They showed, okay, gas production in Russia might be growing, but first, Gazprom is losing its share of production, the dark blue one. Then Russian gas consumption is not increasing at all. And BP placed the future prognosis for gas exports in some sort of a mist. They say it's a great uncertainty because there are no markets for it. Absolutely. Because when the Russian officials from Gazprom say, you know, if you Europeans are not hurry up, if you do not build some gas pipelines towards our future distribution hub on the Turkish territory that we are going to create, then we are going to switch to some alternative markets. What alternative markets are there? It's zero. No China, no LNG. Maybe everybody remembers how Gazprom promised to conquer 10 to 20% of the American gas market with its LNG. Forget it. That was just pure slogans. So we see that oil and gas production challenge, that we see the industry is in a very difficult situation. We see that the Russian economy has very weak prospects of growing at all. And it is going to affect Russia's global role, political role. And the big question remains what strategy the government will pursue. Last year, I attended a seminar in the Carnegie Center in Moscow, and we discussed possible scenarios for Russia. Well, oil prices were high at that time. And we identified, well, with all the ambitions Russia is going to, we do not know how Russia is going to defend its global role. We discussed 3 possible scenarios, but I'll boil them down to 2. Well, first, it is integration into the Western civilization. Politically, economically, that means democracy, freedom of speech, and liberal market, encouragement of private business, transparency, and so on. And the conclusion of the audience in the Carnegie seminar was the probability of this scenario is 0. Well, the other scenario was some sort of Cold War psychology with oppression and no transparency. Well, you see a totalitarian regime and economic mobilization of the, well, wartime mobilization under the slogan with we are confronted by an enemy. Everybody is an enemy, and only Russia is white and fluffy and pure. And well, there was a fifth scenario, and the third scenario, and the scenario was Russia is slowly becoming a colony of China. Well, it deserves some thinking about, because there are some signals that point in that direction. Well, what's going on actually in Russia? How Russia is meeting the challenges of low prices and decrease in oil production and the blind alley of the Russian gas industry? Well, first, privatization, no, forget it. In fact, it is creeping deprivatization. It is corruption, inefficiency, and a type of capitalism which we call crony capitalism. Then it is xenophobia and the patriotic banners. Attempts to subjugate other former Soviet republics. We are witnessing what happened with Georgia. We are witnessing what's going on in Ukraine. And there are some people in the Baltic republics and in northern Kazakhstan who suspect that it will be their turn after Mr. Putin is encouraged by his successes in Ukraine and Georgia. We see that the economy is managed by some manual control. It's not a free economy. Since the management is inefficient and very often non-logical, so we see the dire consequences of such management. We see that, in fact, military budgets and propaganda budgets are growing, and pension funds are shrinking, and the expenses on education, on health, and so on science are shrinking as well. And well, in contrast with the famous legend about Singapore, Russia is behaving very strangely on an international arena. There was a legend about the Singapore dictator who wanted to make his very poor country one of the richest ones in the world, and he went all over the world asking bankers and CEOs of big companies, what can I do in my poor Singapore to make this land comfortable for your investments and capital? And he did what they recommended. When the Russian officials go abroad, they teach other countries how they should behave to accommodate Gazprom and some other government-controlled monopolies and agencies to provide red carpet treatment for them. So it's some sort of behavior as well. Well, to conclude, I believe the outcome might be disastrous. And I read today some of the bloggers on the Russian internet. They were very much encouraged by some publications in the US media about the advice to the US administration to increase support of Ukraine, to supply maybe some sort of weapons to Ukraine, and to confront Mr. Putin more decisively. Because what Mr. Putin thinks and does shows that he is basing his decision-making on the assumption that the West as a whole, the United States, the European Union are disjointed. There is no solidarity. They are weak. They cannot react powerfully to what he does. And he thinks since our adversaries are so weak, we can do what we want. So I'll stop here. Maybe I will answer some questions afterwards. Thank you.
Well. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mikhail, and thanks to the three of you. It's one of the ironies of having a job like mine that I'm sometimes thrust into the position of having to defend the viability of the dysfunctional course that Russia is on. And let me do so by posing a specific question to you, Mikhail, but then a broader question for the panel, and then we'll open it up. The specific question is, if you're right that Russia can't sell its gas and nobody wants its gas, How is it that Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi just signed a $500 billion 10-year gas deal? You knew that question was coming. But the broader question, so to give the other panelists a chance to think about this, Bijan had some warning as well, is what about the marginal shifts that are taking place? And we do see them in some of the BRICS economies and more broadly in economies that are not part of either the Western sanctions camp or the Russian camp per se. And that is to sort of hedge bets, to shift away from being vulnerable to kind of the Western-dominated transactions system internationally. It's not necessarily a direct consequence of oil prices, but it seems that it is also related, right? This notion of vulnerability that's been described in a number of government budget scenarios, it seems like it can be helped by establishing a different set of relationships, ones that are not vulnerable to the United States, be it in energy or be it in politics and sanctions. So Mikhail and then whoever else wants to comment, please.
Well, first about the Chinese contract, so to say, contract. It's not a contract. It's, again, a memorandum of understanding because it does not contain the formula of the gas price, the most important element of that. Well, I have in my computer the economic section of the pre-feasibility study of the Chinese project. They have calculated, Gazprom experts have calculated the economics every year till 2048. And there are 26 scenarios, different scenarios for that project. And in the majority of the scenarios, there are two very important factors, which is the payback period. If you calculate it by net profit, the average payback period is 18.5 years. Well, it's possible to. But nobody calculates it like that. You must calculate it by discounted net profit. And in the Gazprom document, it says no, never. Because even at 2048, you cannot get payback from your projects. It's a costly project. And when Gazprom said, okay, we are going to sign that document, it was a political measure, because the Chinese do not want that gas at all. They can do without. And the Russians hoped that the price of gas is high enough to justify at least some of the production of that gas in eastern Siberia. Now, when I speak to Gazprom officials, they are in panic. They say the price of gas is going to be for China maybe $7 to $8 per 1 million BTU. And the cost, the production and transportation cost of Russian gas is going to be 11 to 12. It's impossible to sell it without subsidizing the Chinese consumer at the cost of the Russian taxpayers. After all, Gazprom is 50% national company. It's controlled by the state. So it's a political action. And when the Russians say, okay, we are going, this is what Mr. Putin says, that's what Gazprom says, we are going to direct as much gas to Asia as we are selling in Europe. Please, maybe they were ill when they studied arithmetic in the elementary school. But I believe that this is physically impossible. Yes.
May I comment
Please.
on the gas
Absolutely.
issue? I think I agree with most of what you say, but I think there is one other dimension to gas that we should not forget, and that's all the gas-based industries, petrochemicals, steel, aluminium, and so on. And because gas is also very important for Iran and also in the Iranian energy strategy, we can also imagine a scenario where countries like Russia and Iran actually invest more and more in gas-based industries rather than exporting gas. And one fact we know, no matter what happens in China in terms of energy equation and India and other markets, also some of these BRIC markets that you were mentioning, there will be a growing demand for commodities. The more cars are produced and other industrial goods. So I think we should not be absolutely certain that there is no future for Russian gas. There will be potential for gas-based industries both in Russia but also in other countries that could emerge. Just as a side note. I think I would like to answer your question this way. I think one of the medium to long-term impacts of the U.S. Inclination to sanction other countries, I mean my country, Mikhail's country, and other countries, sanction others and try to penalize others, is that more and more countries in the world become wary of depending on the US and Western economies and Western sort of services and so on, especially in the field of the financial realm. So you do see a tendency, for example, just to mention that, the non-aligned movement have been the biggest supporters of Iran's nuclear program, not because they like Iran, but because they want to sort of oppose this behavior pattern of sanctioning another country, because they know one day it could be their country that will be sanctioned. In response to that, there is a greater movement towards decoupling from Western services, Western economies, and looking for areas where these countries can actually cooperate. Look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And look at one of the most recent developments. Iran, for example, has been one of the observer nations in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now even Russia is suggesting that Iran should become a member. Why? Because there is potential in doing things, trading, energy exchange, and other financial exchanges with Iran outside the realm of the Western financial world. So I think this should be, maybe this could be a topic for one of your Wilson Center's future seminars, because I think there is definitely truth to that, that the countries, especially the powers outside the Western world, are looking for areas of cooperation without the Western world.
Yes, I think I'd like to add that China is very strong all over Africa. It has had a mixed success in different places. In some countries, it's also given a lot of concessions. I'm aware that in Sierra Leone, it has some concessions, some grants that are given to nationals have been given to the Chinese. In Nigeria, it has not been as successful. We still have a very, very strong Chinese presence. The Russians have come in as well to have some sort of cooperation with gas. It was not very successful. Gazprom had to go back at a point. We also have had cooperation with India. Now, all this, they've been there in different places. The Chinese are everywhere. They're in transportation, they're in coal, they're all over the place. Their success, though, in petroleum has not been as strong, but the primary reason has been the fact that we have a system in dire need of reform. And the legal and regulatory framework is such that it's difficult for any serious investor that is not already in the country and not familiar with the country to actually come in and do anything substantial. But definitely, without a doubt, we have been looking towards China, and a lot of the Chinese companies are very entrenched in the system, just waiting in petroleum. They're working already in electricity and having some success. So it's definitely an alternative route that we're looking
That's
at.
great. And also I would note that you answered, before I had a chance to ask, even one of the questions we received from the overflow room. But before I go to another of those, why don't I see if there are any questions here? Just put your hand up. We have mics on both sides of the room. Yes, right here in the front. And you just identify yourself and your affiliation, please.
I'm Charles Cobb. I'm a trustee at Wilson Center. My question relates to Europe's competitive price for natural gas from Russia compared to LNG. Can you share with us, particularly as it relates to the Ukraine and other places, is LNG from possibly the United States, possibly from other Gulf countries, is it competitive with this high cost of natural gas you say that Russia now has?
Yes, definitely. We see that Russia was selling last year, before the prices went havoc. Russia was selling gas at about $300 per 1,000 cubic meters on the border of Germany.
Convert that to
that's a little less than $9 per 1 million BTU. And at the same time, we saw that the price of gas on the spot market in Europe was about 8. So it was lower than the contracted price in Germany. And when we look at Ukraine, the price of gas is even higher. Right now it is going to decrease because about some 9 months it takes gas prices to follow the oil and refined products prices in long-term gas contracts.
How about LNG equivalents from the United States?
LNG affects the spot prices in Europe. And now Gazprom has to do something which is called commercial cannibalism. It sends gas, the same product, onto the same markets in Europe, in Germany, for example, via the Nord Stream pipeline, at 2 prices, contracted prices, termed contract prices, which are higher, and to the spot market, undermining its own position on the same market. So if you want some gas, I can arrange a contract with Gazprom at a very convenient price.
Now, I'm trying to get whether U.S.
Just a second. I think your voice won't be
Yes,
picked up.
yes. I think it is competitive, and it shows that some of the clients of Gazprom and the Russian companies are signing contracts. They're signing commitments to receive LNG from U.S. projects. At the same time, they are signing some contracts with Gazprom. So it's very competitive.
Let me take this opportunity to actually throw in a question that came from Overflow. I think for the two of you, because it literally fits right in between, and that's what's the role of Azerbaijan in production in this region, right? Literally in between Russia and Iran, or is it too small to matter?
Azerbaijan can produce maybe 8 years, maybe 5 years from now, additionally some 10 to 12 billion cubic meters a year for exports to Europe, not more. This is the most it can produce. It's, well, Gazprom delivers to Western Europe 138 billion cubic meters of gas. It's not 10, it's not 12. If, in addition to Azerbaijan, some companies agree to use Turkey as a hub to deliver some more gas via the future southern gas corridor, it could be now 10, according to existing pipeline from Iran, it is 10 billion cubic meters a year. The Iranians are building another route which can double or even triple this volume. Then we have the Iraqi Kurdistan, which theoretically can produce 30 billion cubic meters of gas a year. Then we have Israel. Then we have something around Cyprus. And if an agreement is reached to cross the Caspian Sea with a pipeline, then Turkmenistan can add from 15 to 20 billion cubic meters of gas a year. It would replace Gazprom gas in the southern Europe.
Okay. Other questions in the room? Yes, sir, right here. There's a microphone coming.
I have a question for the Iranian person there. Former Secretary of State Harold Schultz recently gave testimony at the Defense Committee in the Senate, and he said definitely the Iranian nuclear program is to achieve a nuclear weapon. And so I ask you the question, would that be in the interests of Iran to promote or to facilitate nuclear proliferation in the Middle East?
Well, I don't know. It's a little bit off topic. Do you want to comment on
I don't agree with former Secretary of State. So I don't think this is what Iran is after. And I think speculating after these things, we could sit and speculate after a lot of states and their intentions and what they would do. That's pure speculation. There has been no evidence in that direction. And I think it would be a mistake to use the time of a conference like this about a topic like energy to speculate about the Iranian intentions.
Can I just ask one follow-up, though, which is when you showed that divergence, it's quite
Yep.
powerful, right? It's literally 100% increase in revenue if a deal is struck. Does that continue how sticky is the deal, in the sense that there's a lot of people who are concerned that, as in the past, there might be fudging by Iran around the edges of a deal. Do they keep the benefits in terms of the export revenue? Do they get the access do they need, et cetera, all of that, if there's fudging and the sort of diplomatic back and forth that we had, say, 10 years ago, as opposed to the acute crisis of the last few years? Have you thought about that scenario?
I think the Iranian situation, both the economic situation and also the political situation, the different complexities, is so complex that any scenario will produce advantages and disadvantages. So you can show that graph and say, well, oil revenues are going to double. Other stakeholders will come and say, well, as soon as oil revenues double, all the economic reforms are going to stop. Yeah. So let's not have a deal. Let's. So there are so many sort of multifaceted issues within the political and economic, and also especially the nuclear dynamics of Iran, that it would be a mistake to believe that one scenario or the other scenario is going to advance a specific situation. I think we have to just accept that Iran has a lot of resources. What I didn't manage to mention in a lot of detail is the gas factor. I mean, Iran's gas production today is about to surpass its oil production. When you convert gas production into oil equivalent, Iran's gas production is becoming more important than its oil production. So in a way, Iran can say, well, we will actually have a lot more from advancing our gas industries and gas-based industries compared to insisting on a specific oil scenario. But there is no doubt that this government, this Hassan Rouhani, the moderate government we have, would like to have a deal, because it will also unleash a lot of other benefits, economic benefits, regional benefits, psychological benefits. But obviously it's not just in the Iranian hands right now.
Good. Yes, right here. When you guys are in the exact middle seat, it really confuses our microphone.
Hi, my name is Mikhail. I'm from the University of Montreal. I'm a graduate. I was wondering, this question may apply to all three panelists. A continuing of the lower oil price in the future, do you think that it may encourage state building measures in your respective countries of origin, a building of a more robust tax infrastructure to retain to retain the tax within the country? Sorry.
It's a great question, and let me take the opportunity to add this one specifically for Nigeria, but others are welcome to comment as well. Accounting for corruption and incompetence and all of those things, what would austerity look like in each of these cases? And what would be cut and what would be kept?
Shall I start with the question?
Please, yes.
First of all, the Iranian response, the sort of legislative response has been to work on a law to make state budgets completely independent of oil income, which means that they have to obviously increase the tax revenues and find ways to interact, if you want, with the economy. And obviously, this is one scenario where, as you say, you can also foresee institution building, state building, democratization, and so on. So that's usually that, and that's what I meant when I said low oil prices lead to reforms, legal, economic, political reforms that are significant. There are other very interesting aspects are, for example, for the first time there has been a genuine push to make various so-called semi-state organizations to actually start paying taxes. And that is again significant, because first of all it makes the overall economic environment more competitive. If semi-state organizations are not paying taxes, then the private sector that is paying taxes has a disadvantage, and if they can remove that, it will benefit the business climate. Very quickly about austerity, it has already started. In Iran, the first step they have taken is that they have announced that in the new Iranian year, which starts on the 21st of March, anyone earning more than $1,000 a month will be eliminated from the list of cash handouts receivers. And these cash handouts have been the sort of compensation for subsidy reforms or for higher energy costs. So this is part of the austerity, which is going to hit if they do it well, and if it's not faced with corruption, it is going to hit the sort of middle to upper income classes, but it is going to have an impact. Obviously, part of the transaction, the financial transaction from the government to the society is being removed, and we have to see what the repercussions are. But these are the areas where they will start austerity. But I will stop here.
Oh, Yinka.
Yeah, thank you. Lower oil prices are not necessarily a bad thing. Like I've said, in Nigeria, I can see that for one thing, we have to diversify, and that is something we have been talking about a long time. And so other industries will now come up much stronger. We have a lot of minerals that have not been exploited. We have immense gas reserves. Our gas has hardly really been utilized. I mean, it has been minimally. We've got the LNG in operation. But we actually should have a real gas framework, and we should be able to utilize it for internal use, and probably be able to export throughout the region. So it gives us an opportunity to be able to do some things once there is a responsive government. It even helps us as regards the industry to tidy up some things. For example, it doesn't make sense for us now with low prices to be exporting a lot only to bring it back as refined products, to export crude and bring back products. So it also should mean that we will clean up our downstream sector and make sure that our refineries are totally functional, and when necessary will increase our refining capacity. So low prices do allow the country to do a lot of things, to look at other areas that were actually functional before the oil boom came in. So if things go right, to look on the bright side, we should have something that amounts to a reversal of the oil curse. So those are some things I'd say. Now, somebody says, what would austerity look like? Well, in Nigeria, it would essentially be increased taxation. And as you all know, that is not something you talk about when you're talking about elections. And so everybody's just talking about austerity measures, and the Minister of Finance is under a lot of pressure, is largely unpopular. Reforms have failed. And so people are just talking about taxation, but definitely there will be increased taxation. And if it's done right as well, it gives us an opportunity to positively impact in the country. I have to say that there is one state that has functioned very well without oil, and that is Lagos State. And it has increased its levels of taxation, but the people pay more willingly in Lagos than they do in other places because they see what is being done with their money. So I'll primarily say that that is what I would see. So the more affluent people will feel the effects of the austerity more, hopefully.
Well, austerity, I'll give you one example. When the Russian government announced that this year they are going to increase the size of the monthly pensions to pensionists in rubles from one sum to another sum, that it means that in fact the pensions are going from 252 euros to 180 euros. So maybe this is austerity, I'm not sure, but when we see that whatever funds have remained in the Russian sovereign funds right now are being distributed to costly, politicized and absolutely non-economic projects such as a bridge to the Crimea Peninsula, or some loans to Rosneft oil company, which has already pledged most of its oil to China, and even that oil which has not been discovered yet, not only produced, not only drilled, but proven in some fields, it is already sold to China. It belongs to China. They already received that money, and the company is deeply in debt. And so some of the, billions of dollars will go to support this absolutely inadequately managed company instead of diversification of the Russian industries and so on. So I don't believe in any positive effect of the austerity measures. The problem with Russia is the tempo of the crisis. If it is very slow, it could take the Russian regime years and years to disappear or to get some changes in its structure. If the crisis develops very quickly, maybe it would be a much more desirable solution. Maybe we'll see some changes sooner than a decade from now.
Well, I have an angry red light flashing at me, so I think that'll be it for the panel discussion. I want to thank all three of you and invite my colleague Jan Kalitsky, who I introduced before, to close us up.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Both your panel and the first one on the Western Hemisphere brought great regional depth to the impact of low oil prices, and it would not be a good thing for me to try to summarize everything that we've heard this afternoon because it's extraordinarily rich. But I do have just a few takeaway points that struck me as I was listening to all of the speakers. The first is the question of reliance on a single commodity, and it clearly hits you that if you do that, it's not very good news economically for you, and that the importance of diversification to guard against ups and downs in the price environment. And some countries are better diversified. I think of Canada or the US obviously as examples, but others are kind of surprises. For example, Saudi Arabia is upping its game in diversification, which is a little bit of a surprise. So that's one. The second is the institutional framework, which again was emphasized in this panel, the need for transparency, the need for well-governed institutions, the higher risk that corrupt or autocratic systems face in a lower oil price environment. You know, and we heard in the positive side again about Canada or Norway certainly is a positive example of transparency and good governance. We also heard about Nigeria and others in this panel, and Venezuela was another negative example cited earlier. Third, getting back to what we have been looking at here at the center, the necessity for a U.S. energy policy, which is not just made in Washington by Washington experts without reference to the expertise that's in the other part of the world, and the importance of interacting not only in terms of U.S. policy, but in terms of regional policy and global energy policy in a way that really makes sense for the overall world economy. So whether we're talking about diversification or governance or transparency or an integrated energy policy, these are some of the takeaways from an extraordinarily rich conference. All are influenced clearly by the price environment, and please join me again in applauding this afternoon's two outstanding panels.